Okay, this is Byrchall High School, a revision podcast. This one is on the respiratory system. And don't forget, you can go back and listen to any of the other podcasts or any other section of the GCSE course. Always remember we are doing the OCR syllabus. Just go on to Rob Williams Byrchall on YouTube and go onto the playlist for GCSE PE, and you'll find a podcast for most of the topics on the course there, and if they're not, we'll be adding them as we go. This is paper one topic. Remember, there's no footage on this. Is just an audio podcast, so nothing to look at on the screen. It's just listen to it, so it's headphones in and go. It's just another way of revising. Don't forget, you've also got your knowledge organisers, your books to revise from, your homeworks to revise from. You can also use GCSE Pod we've done work on. We've also used GCSE Bite Size, so lots of different ways of revise. Remember, we are doing the OCR syllabus. So this one is on the respiratory system. Three parts of the respiratory system, and that is the lungs, air and breathing. Again, a common error commonly made by people is when they ask a question about breathing, they start talking about heart things, which would be the cardiovascular system. While we acknowledge that they do have to cross in some ways because it's blood that carries oxygen, the questions are often separate. So cardiovascular system is asking about the heart, blood and blood vessels, and this one, the respiratory system, is asking about the lungs, air and breathing. So first thing is to know the pathway of air that goes to get air into the body. Notice I say air and not oxygen, because air is not all oxygen. It also contains other gases that we don't use, we just breathe back out again, such as nitrogen. So we say we breathe in air. So we breathe in air through the nose and the mouth. It then comes down the body and again down internally through the trachea. The trachea is the main, what you might call the windpipe. Obviously, we need the anatomical GCSE name, which is the trachea, which is held open by C-shaped rings of cartilage. From the trachea, we branch out into two bronchi, which one goes towards one lung and one goes to the other. From the bronchi, we go to the bronchioles, which are smaller branches. And on the end of the bronchioles, we have alveoli, which I'll talk more about in a minute, but this is where gas exchange takes place. The alveoli are very thin, so they can have diffusion of gases through them. So oxygen diffuses out and carbon dioxide will diffuse in. Obviously, when the gases diffuse out of the alveoli, it would go into a capillary. The capillary would take that oxygen to a red blood cell, and a red blood cell would then transport the oxygen back to the heart and then off via the aorta to the rest of the body, to the working muscles and to the vital organs. So just to repeat that, it goes nose and mouth, then down to trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, alveoli, which is where gas exchange happens, capillaries, then red blood cells, and then off to other parts of the body. If it was for breathing out, expiration, it would just be the other way around. So you'd have red blood cells bringing carbon dioxide back. Capillaries would then take it to the alveoli. It would diffuse through the alveoli, then go alveoli, bronchioles, bronchi, trachea, and then you breathe out through your nose and mouth. It's just the other way around. So that is our basic pathway of air in and out of the body. We also have the mechanism of breathing in and out. So inspiration is breathing in. So to inspire would be breathing in. Expiration or expire would be to breathe out. And again, we've covered this in lessons, but you need to know that when you breathe in, the intercostal muscles contract. That raises the ribs. The ribs go up and out. The diaphragm, which is a sheet of muscle underneath the lungs, would contract, which would flatten, therefore increasing the volume of the chest cavity so that you'd have a larger space, and then the air would rush into the lungs as the lungs inflated. So that is for inspiration. Intercostal muscles contract, raise the ribs, diaphragm contracts to flatten, pressure, and it would then pull the air down into the lungs and the lungs would inflate. Expiration would be the opposite. So again, the intercostal muscles would relax. This would move the ribs down and in. The diaphragm would also relax, therefore it would go back up, so it would go dome-shaped again. and the chest cavity would decrease in volume and the air would be forced out of the lungs. So in expiration, I'll repeat that again, intercostal muscles relax, moving the ribs down and in, diaphragm relaxes, therefore going up and dome shaped. Lungs deflate as the chest cavity volume decreases and the air is forced out of the lungs. So that would be the opposite again, pretty much an opposite way around the inspiration and expiration. Okay, we mentioned before a little bit about the alveoli. I just want to make just a little bit more mention of that because that's where gas exchange happens, and this gas exchange is very important. So alveoli are little tiny air sacs that sit at the end of your bronchioles. The more you have of these, the better, because it allows more gas exchange. The more you have, the more surface area you have for gases to diffuse through, and that would both directions, obviously getting oxygen in and getting carbon dioxide out. So we want a massive surface area. They are surrounded by capillaries, which then do the job of taking any oxygen to the red blood cells, or again bringing it back, waste product of carbon dioxide, and putting it back into the alveoli. And we've sort of said this before, but this whole process of breathing and then gas exchange, the key to this is we want as much oxygen in the body as possible. We all end up back at aerobic and anaerobic. We want to stay aerobic for as long as possible, which is respiring aerobically using oxygen. Obviously, when you don't go aerobic and the intensity goes too high, you can't get enough oxygen to the working muscles, you go anaerobically, but then you can't stay anaerobic for long, and that's where you'll eventually get lactic acid. So the more gas exchange we get, the more chance we've staying aerobic for as long as possible. We have 3 definitions that we also need to know for the respiratory system. So we have, again, it's important you don't get these mixed up with ones from other systems, such as the cardiovascular system. But we have breathing rate. Breathing rate is the easy one, which is the number of times you breathe in a minute. So if you are going to write BPM, you might write that for heart rate, for beats per minute, but this is breaths per minute for the respiratory system. You must write breaths per minute because obviously it could be construed as either. So breathing rate is number of breaths taken in a minute. You also have tidal volume. So tidal volume is the amount of air breathed in or out in one breath. So in and out in one breath. So again, tide comes in, tide goes out. So in and out and in one breath. So amount of air coming in and out per breath is tidal volume. And the final one you would need to know is minute volume, which is the amount of air you breathe in or out each minute. And again, so in and out in a minute, you can work, there's actually a formula to work this out. So minute volume, which is the amount of air in and out per minute, is breathing rate times tidal volume. And again, you just need to know those definitions, but also you need to be able to say what would happen to them short term and long term. So let's just go back through. So breathing rate, which is the number of breaths in a minute. If you started exercising regularly, that would increase. You have to breathe more often to get more oxygen into the system. Resting breathing rate may drop in the long term if you can get bigger breaths in. Resting only as a long-term effect of exercise. So short-term breathing rate will increase. Long-term resting breathing rate may drop. Tidal volume, which again is the amount of air you breathe in and out in a breath, which you might call how deeply you breathe. Short term, it would increase because you take deeper breaths as you're exercising, and long term, you would also increase that because you'd want a bigger lung capacity and more air coming in per breath. So long term, you'd also get a larger tidal volume. Minute volume, again, so the amount of air breathed in and out each minute. Short term, that would increase, and long term, it would also increase. But again, we'd want that long term increase to get more oxygen into the system, so you would stay aerobic for longer. Okay, the final thing I want to mention, and we did talk about this in the cardiovascular system, is just that aerobic and anaerobic, because obviously, yes, the blood transport the oxygen, but it's also about air getting into the system. Just to recap, aerobic exercise uses oxygen for energy production. Normally includes activities that are longer but of a lower intensity, moderate or low intensity. You cannot go high intensity aerobically for very long, as you'll go anaerobic. And it's all about getting this oxygen into the system so that your muscles will work with oxygen. So examples of sports, anything long distance with a lower intensity. So marathon running, triathlon, long distance swimming, long distance rowing, long distance cycling, etc. The energy equation for aerobic exercise is oxygen plus glucose. So two things power the muscle: oxygen from air, glucose, which you would get from food, and that would equal energy first of all, because that's what you want on the other end. But you'd also get carbon dioxide as a waste product. You'd also get water, and you'd probably get a little bit of heat as well. Anaerobic exercise is where you don't use oxygen for energy production. This is where the intensity would be higher, so it would be short bursts of really high intense activity. You haven't got time to get the oxygen or the capacity to get enough oxygen there because the demand is so high. So you just refer back to using just stored energy from food. So this would be activities such as sprinting, 100 meters and 200 meters, maybe shot put, long jump, triple jump, possibly weightlifting, highly intense short activities. And again, so we go back to our energy equation, we now can't get enough oxygen there, so the muscle is powered by just glucose. What we get out the other side of the equation would be energy again, but we'd also get lactic acid this time. Because the oxygen has gone, the carbon dioxide waste product would go. So it's now glucose equals energy plus lactic acid. Just a couple of things about the exam. I mean, there hasn't been lots of questions on the respiratory system, but there are questions that sort of talk around it. So one of the common questions that's often got wrong as well is a question about why does the percentage of oxygen change in inspired air to expired? Well, quite simply, because you've used some of the oxygen. So regardless of how much you use, and we have talked about that in lessons, you breathe in air, you take some of the oxygen out of the air, you send it off to the working muscles, and you use it for aerobic respiration. Therefore, the percentage of oxygen in the air would reduce. You'd breathe out more carbon dioxide because you've produced carbon dioxide as a waste product. So if you see that question asking about why does the percentage of oxygen in air change, it's because you've used some of that oxygen for aerobic respiration. Therefore, the percentage will have dropped, and you've produced more carbon dioxide during aerobic respiration. Therefore, that would change as well, and that would to be breathed out. So that was why they changed. But it's a question often asked, but often got wrong. So we've basically got that is the summary of our respiratory system. Not a long podcast, this one. As I said, yes, there is some crossover with cardiovascular in that it's the blood that picks it up and the capillaries, etc. And obviously, remember, we looked at capillarization. We want more capillaries to get more oxygen into the bloodstream and getting rid of waste, etc. But it is its own separate system. You need to know those definitions we talked about before, and that journey of air, should I say, into the system and out of the system. And we now know how breathing works, and it all goes back to this aerobic, anaerobic thing. Remember those other revision methods, and obviously you can ask questions as you need to, or come and see me, etc. So best of luck with that one. See you later.